quick kind of introductory observation about where we are right now, going through becoming Catholic. And then we'll dive into the questions that, we'll start with the questions that you might have at table, and then we'll use the questions that people have kind of sent in as well on the website in case we don't have enough questions from the table, but we're an inquisitive group, I'm sure we do. So let me ask you a question to start. How do you become Catholic? How does somebody become Catholic? Say it again. By choice, exactly. So hear this, please. This is huge. There's only one way to become a Catholic. There's only one way to become Christian. And that is, you have to make the choice. So I can't become Catholic because my mom and dad were Catholic. I can't become Catholic even because I was baptized. That alone is not enough. I have to sooner or later make a decision to live my life as a disciple, which means to respond to all that we talked about when we went through the Kerygma, most especially to make a response to what it is that Jesus has accomplished for us by his death and his resurrection and his ascension. There is no other way to become Catholic. There's no other way to become a Christian. We could also say the only way to become Christian is by conversion. What's conversion? Conversion is the way I think in images, right? So my way of thinking of conversion is I used to walk this direction, and then an event happened in my life. I met someone, and it changed the trajectory of my life, and now I walk in this direction. Okay? So what we've been trying to do in becoming Catholic to date, okay, has been kind of preparatory work, just kind of laying out the basics of the gospel so that we can all have a solid foundation. Going through those questions that Joe just summarized again for us. Why are we here? What in the world happened? What's God done about it? And what am I going to do in response to what God has done? This is the end now after this week. This is more or less the end of that stage. So here's what I would encourage you to think. For those of you who've been, kind of like the inner circle, if you will, because you're the ones who are discerning. So those of you who are here for not an update, like I'm already Catholic, I just want to learn more, but I'm interested in perhaps becoming Catholic. I would encourage you to think that if you're still here, that's significant. And if you're still here, the reason I would say it's significant is because God himself is calling you. And he's calling you to start thinking more seriously about the decision. And if you're going to think more seriously about the decision, it means I have to take some concrete steps to be able to respond more intentionally with that decision-making process. Things like, if I'm not yet praying every day, even if it's something as simple as getting up in the morning and spending some time reflecting on the day, thanking God for the gift of life, asking his blessing and direction on those encounters I'm going to have today, whether it's at work or with family or whatever it might be, ending the day by spending a few minutes in reflection, looking back over the day with God, thanking him for those blessings that you've received, asking forgiveness for those times when I know I haven't lived the way I should have lived. That would be one thing we want to try to get into a habit of. Reading Scripture every day. Most especially reading the Gospels. Could be just reading the Gospel that we're going to hear for the Sunday coming up. That way we're preparing to hear it. It's not, and especially for those of us who have children, preparing for Mass on the way here is anything than leisurely. So you're like walking down the hall like, we're already at the creed. Like, oh my gosh. So we have a virtual parish in the hallways. I see a lot of you there supposedly attending Mass. I can only imagine what that's like. So God bless you for doing that. It's great. Glad we built the hallway for you. And I'm glad we got the sound in the hallway. But so read the gospel in anticipation and just be asking the Lord every day, like, speak to me. You don't need a doctorate in theology to read Scripture. Just speak to me. Help me to understand this. What are you trying to say to me right now in your word? And then a third thing would be making sure at this point, if you're still with us, to get to Mass every Sunday. Because we do that. Like, we go to Mass every week. It's a commandment. So just an encouragement to us, if we are amongst that group who is discerning whether or not we're going to become Catholic, kind of up your response if it's not at that level right now. Pray every day, read the scriptures, especially the gospel, and get to Mass. And then just be praying in a particular way, maybe simply something as simple as this. Lord, if this is true, show it to me. Help me to see truth. Like, give light to me. That's what faith is. Faith is a light. Faith isn't blind. Faith is a way of knowing. Help me to know. Okay, does that make sense? So, kudos to you for still being with us. And see that the Lord is trying to pull you. Remember, the initiative in all this is God's. Faith is not so much about us seeking God, it's really God seeking us. That's the really extraordinary thing, is that God, who is infinitely happy, not bored, doesn't need friends, wants me as his friend. I don't know why. I bring nothing to the party. Neither do you. Except you. And God wants you as a friend. And so he's desiring this. So let's just keep asking him to make himself clear, okay? So what we're going to do next after we finish tonight, and we're not going to meet next week, so just so you know that, right? So it's Thanksgiving, we're not here. But what we're going to do next is really kind of dive into a completely different set of topics. So this is kind of the end of the preparatory stage. And then we're going to go deep on some critical issues, which oftentimes are hang-ups for people. And then that'll be phase 2, if you will, of becoming Catholic. Okay. Questions that you have at tables. So again, we want to reserve this in a particular way to right here, right? Because we want to really give prime of place to those who, you guys have got a lot of questions, I'm sure, over here at table 3. Only one. Got one?
Yeah.
Go for it.
So hold on.
Sorry, we need the mic. I had one responsibility and I failed.
Okay. Yeah, I'm already loud. I'm just kidding. We want to know, why is Rome home if Jesus was born in Bethlehem?
Great question. Okay, so back to last week's, why is Rome home if Jesus is born in Bethlehem? So we can answer that a couple ways. In a certain sense, the world is home. Right, so if you were at, many of us had a chance to come to the liturgy that we celebrated Thursday night on All Saints. So if you can remember that was the passage in the Gospels where we had the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, whatnot. And that passage begins by Jesus sitting down on the ground. And the observation, I think I made that night, was that's not an empty gesture. That's not because he was looking around and there were no chairs. To sit is the position of a teacher in the ancient world, and to sit on the ground is a way of saying the earth is his throne. And so the world is God's, and everything in it. The universe is God's. So everything properly belongs to him. That would be the first thing. The fact that God chooses to become man in Israel, and particularly to be born in Bethlehem, is significant because the Jewish people are the people who God, we could say, scandalously chose to be the ones through whom he would give his son. So here's how N.T. Wright, so Calvin and I were talking about N.T. Wright, who's a great Anglican scholar. He has this, I think it's a really helpful way to think about salvation history. So God's plan for you and me, the whole human race, was that we would be divinized, sharing his own life for all eternity. That was the reason that he created us, right? That's why there's something rather than nothing. He made us, and he made us to be divinized. At the very beginning, our race goes off the rails. Okay, so we're like a car that drove into the ditch thanks to Adam and Eve's rebellion. Okay? He sends a rescue vehicle to pull the car out of the ditch. The rescue vehicle is the people of Israel. That car itself goes into the ditch because it's part of the first car. So because the people of Israel belong to the human race, so even though they're sent, commissioned in a particular way to be the means by which humanity would be rescued, they themselves need to be rescued. You with me so far? So God further sends, through the descendants of Israel, who's also a member of the human race, his son, someone to pull both cars out of the ditch. That's Jesus. That's why Israel is so significant. So that's why the Old Testament is so important for Christians. It's not like that's the Jewish book and like there's nothing to do with us. It's one long book, one author. God's telling the whole story. And Israel has a prominent part to play still in it. Okay, so Bethlehem's very important, and places are very important because God acts in time, and he acted, like you can go to Bethlehem. Anybody been to Bethlehem? So a few of us have. So if you go to Bethlehem, you can, or if you go to Nazareth, Nazareth might be another example. Nazareth is a dumpy little hill town. At the time of Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, there's maybe 200 people who lived there. So there's a church built on top of, just like St. Peter's, we looked at that. There's a church built on top of, if this wasn't Mary's home, like Mary's home was there, because there just weren't that many people that lived there, right? And in this church, there's a spot on the ground, and it says, you'll all know what this means, right? Verbum caro factum est hic. Got that, right? So, other questions? So that means the Word was made flesh here. Like Mary she was either here, maybe she was there, right? But she's here when Gabriel brings her the question, will you surrender yourself? So places matter and times matter. So Israel has prime of place because of the fact that that's where God chooses to dwell. Rome has prime of place because the man whom Jesus picks, again scandalously, to be the one upon whom he's going to found the church, dies in Rome. And so does Paul. So Peter and Paul are known as the founders of Rome, of the Church of Rome, the Prince of the Apostles. And because they both give testimony to their faith in Jesus in that city, that's why Rome becomes so significant. It was the center of the world. It ran the world. Once the gospel got to Rome, it got everywhere in the empire.
Right, like you showed us on that map, how it spread.
Exactly. Okay, does that make sense to people?
Yeah, you make things very easy to understand. I like it.
I can remember what other people say.
Sorry.
It's the real gift. I like to read. Okay, how about here? Got a question over here? No. Okay, we'll go over here next. How does that look?
It's just a segue
Sure.
because you set that up. The presentation on the history and the rise of Christianity was fascinating, and you're probably going to tell me that you answered this question that I'm about to ask during your presentation. But you showed the Roman Empire was in white, or across Eurasia and Asia Minor. And then the spread of Christianity was in purple and very pervasive. You also went into great detail about how difficult it was to be a Christian. They were crucified, they were sent to the lions. Those who had seen Jesus didn't fare well. Those who admitted their faith were persecuted. How is it that it could have spread so fast and so widely around that region where everybody would want to, or the ruling power wanted to destroy them?
Right. Okay. Let me try to summarize that real quick. So a couple things. Historically, so from October of 64 until 312, legally it is forbidden to be a Christian. Okay, so there's a law that says it is not licit for a Christian to exist. The reason for that was because Christianity was considered, so the Romans would recognize as a legitimate or authorized religion, anything which was older than the founding of Rome, which is 8th century BC. Judaism is older than that. So Jews, even though they were often looked at with suspicion because they didn't engage in cultic worship with the gods of Rome and whatnot, they were allowed to illicitly exist. The Christians, at a certain point, the Romans recognized these people are not Jews, and so they're new. Because they're new, they're dangerous, like a whole set of other religions, and so they weren't allowed to exist. That doesn't mean that there was a constant time of persecution from 64 to 312. There were 4 major waves of persecution during that 250 years or so, which were horrific. They weren't taking place all throughout the empire, but when they did happen, they happened in a barbarous fashion. So I just want to make sure that we get that. I don't want to claim that Christians were being martyred the whole time. How does it spread, given the fact that it's illegal and it's often violently opposed? I would say by 2 reasons. One is roads. So Roman infrastructure, Roman roads are unbelievable. Because the Romans conquered the world, the known world with the exception of, like, say, China or the American continent, Roman travel suddenly became really simple, all things considering. Right? We wouldn't consider it simple, but it was for them. Paul is able to go all the places that Paul's able to go because of Roman roads. Yeah, no kidding. Our roads are terrible. So, you still use Roman roads today, right? They were patching the road up in front of the church for 3 weeks. like a square this big. So, gosh. So roads were huge, which is significant for us now because the evangelization happened at that time as quickly as it did, in no small part because of the way they were able to travel. Evangelization happens now. The equivalent of Roman roads for us is the internet. We can get everywhere all at once. It's huge for the new evangelization. It's huge for sharing the gospel. At least it has the potential to be. But the other reason, so one's infrastructure, the biggest reason is the witness of people's lives. So that was the point I was trying to make, that so the Roman world was a bleak world. And if you weren't a Roman, and if you weren't a Roman man, you did not have much of a life. So if you're not a Roman citizen, you have very limited rights. If you're not a man, you're considered inferior by everybody amongst the Romans. Intellectually, morally, physically, in every way. So it's a bleak world, really, where power is supreme. Into that world comes the gospel with a revolutionary worldview that no one here is greater than anybody else, that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, that we're all destined to be divinized, that God has become flesh to die for all of us, that we all matter, that there's no unimportant persons, that men and women are radically equal, and that there's reasons to live with hope. And when that message is shared by people who live, they don't just say the words, but they live it authentically, it's attractive as all get out. That's how it spread. So it spread by people being able to get to other places and by people who had a passion. It's another line from Wright where he says, Christianity is not about inner self-discovery and private devotion. It's about public witness and rescue. So the first Christians knew that because they knew, I used to walk in this direction. I used to live with despair. Then I met him, and I don't live that way anymore. And because I don't live that way anymore, I don't want you to live that way anymore. Like, I want to tell you there's another way to live, and it's a way of life which actually has hope in the midst of all the hardships. Doesn't take the hardships away. But it helps you understand there's a point to your life. You matter. You're worth dying for to the creator of the universe. And out of love for you, I want you to know that. And so people went on mission to share that with others, which nobody else did. Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, you had that priest from Vladivostok.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I knew some people that lived in Russia. They're 10 years older than me, what it was like under Stalin. I mean, it can't describe it to people. You just can't. It's just diabolical. Never look at somebody in the eye. Walk to the store with your head down. I mean, just anybody can kill anybody whenever they want. That's really, all they do is make one phone call and you were dead. Your whole family.
Mm-hmm.
How did Christianity maintain itself? It's still there. I don't know. They were killing priests. They were killing anybody that was Christian. How did it do in Russia? Did they do it the same way they did in Rome?
Yeah,
Was it the same bleak
right, so
thing?
The simple way to ask the question is something like, how is it? See, we're so... we have never experienced martyrdom in this country. And so we're under the impression that's about to end. But we're under the impression like it feeds the illusion that religion is just about opinion. It's just about making me feel better. It's about something that I do because my family is Catholic or my family's Lutheran or my family's Hindu or whatever it might be. Whereas the only reason to be anything is because it's true. If it's true, like if I don't just follow some rules, but I love God. Those are two really different things. And you're telling me I can't love him or you're going to X. Well, you know, shoot, I guess you're going to do X. But I can't live with integrity and renounce the one I love. See, we just don't get that. Because we think this is religion. We're not talking about religion. We're talking about faith. And faith is a personal interaction with someone. It's just like marriage. Marriage isn't about an institution. Marriage is about surrendering myself to another individual who's surrendering themselves to me. That's marriage, right? Not an institution. You can describe it institutionally, but at the heart of it is a relationship. So with faith. So it thrives in situations like that. Because then other people see it. That's how it grew. So the English Reformation was a horrific time. So we just celebrated not too long ago. Well, actually, we didn't celebrate his feast day, but there was a writing I just read recently of the martyrdom of a man whose name it would be helpful to remind you of or introduce you to. No, not Thomas More. He's like one of my heroes whose name I can't remember. This is my good friend. What's your name again? English martyr. So he's originally Anglican, becomes Catholic. At his execution, I mean, he dies in, they hang, draw, and quarter you. Who? Yeah, Edmund Campion. Thank you. Good friend Edmund. So, as Campion is dying, his blood spills onto a set of people around him who are so moved by his love as he's being vivisected that they become Catholic. So the witness, there's a maxim in the early church that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So the witness of love, I mean, there's no more convincing witness than that. Because remember, martyrs as a Christian doesn't mean somebody who dies while killing others. Martyrs means somebody who's a witness to the love for the Lord and the love for even the person who's taking their lives. When you see that, that's really attractive. There was remember the Coptic martyrs? Just 4, 5, 6 years ago? These 19, 20, 21, they call them the Coptic martyrs. They were all beheaded by ISIS on a beach. It was all over YouTube, right? I mean, they make a video and then they put it on YouTube. Great. So there's really only, if there's 19 of them, there were only 18 Coptics, or if there were 20, there were only 19 Coptics. The other guy was Muslim who dies. So he had been arrested, didn't follow whatever strain of Islam that those who had abducted him were. So he's jailed with these Christians. And they take them to the beach. And so he's been observing these people imprisoned for however long they'd been imprisoned. And they line them all up, they're on their knees, and then they behead them all, right? And they behead them all with a question first, like either renounce your faith or die. And they get to him. They've killed, I don't know if they'd killed all the other men, but they'd killed most of the other people. They get to this guy who's not a Christian, who's just witnessed their lives. And he looks at the guys with the hatchet and he says, their God is my God. And he dies a Christian, right there. How did he become a Christian? He met real Christians. And persecution, is not fun. It's not romantic in the least. But it does bring out, it reveals who's authentic and who's not. And authentic witness of love is unbelievably attractive. Does that make sense? Did you guys come up with a question yet? No? Okay. How about over here? Got a question here? Sorry. I'm just going to pick on you all night long. You guys got 10 minutes to come up with a question. Come on.
Okay.
Who's next? Yes.
So our question was, how did Peter move from the shallow grave to the wall? Who moved him? When was he moved?
Ooh, great question. Yeah, so remember, Peter dies in October of 64. Shallow grave, tiles shaped like a tent. Erosion comes down the Vatican Hill. They build brick walls over that around 84. Erosion comes down again. They build more brick walls around 104. And then they build this monument from 146 to 161 roughly, which is on top of it, the Red Wall complex, okay? Inside of that, the wall begins to crack, so they build a wall running into it, which looks pretty ugly. So they build another wall. They enclose this wall, not this wall, in the monument that Constantine builds in the early 4th century. Okay, this seemingly meaningless wall, inside of which is that cavity, which was lined with marble, hollowed out, in which they found the bones. Why were there bones there? We don't know for sure. Here's perhaps the most plausible explanation. As we were talking about earlier with regards to persecution, emperors had come and gone who had been tolerant of Christianity. Remember, Constantine's not a Christian. His mother was, but Constantine's not. So, for whatever reason, so you have Christians who have just emerged from an amazingly intense time of persecution. Diocletian's persecution at the beginning of the 4th century, which was massive, okay? So they've just come out of that. They're still alive, the people who endured that, who lost family members or friends, whatever. All of a sudden, Constantine comes, following the line of Diocletian, right? He's in the same chair, if you will. He's the emperor now. He's tolerant, great, but the next guy might not be. So Constantine is being gracious to Christians by building churches for them, but they have no idea what's coming after. They don't know if this guy's going to turn and become violent or if the next guy is going to become violent. And so an explanation, which seems to be as plausible as any other, would be that the Christians say, if you're going to build a monument to Peter, you have to build it here because that's where he's buried. But they move the bones and they don't tell him. Quite simply because they don't trust him. And they don't want anybody to know where Peter is. Because again, the Romans, because Christianity is illegal, would take his body or his bones and throw it into the river. As to whether or not we know that, we don't know that for sure, but that's as logical an explanation as we can put forth. How about over here? Oh, you got one. Too late. I don't want to. Oh.
Okay, hold on. Gotta hold on.
I can talk to them all day long.
Yeah.
Yes, I
They're
can't wait
fun
for
to
this one.
talk to also. Were there Christians that renounced their faith in Jesus Christ before they were persecuted? And what happened to them once did they ever come back into the church?
Yeah,
or
great
what
question.
happened?
So again, martyrdom is not romantic. And lots of Christians under threat of torture, renounced their faith. Then the question became, what do we do with them? Bishops renounced their faith. Priests renounced their faith, especially in a controversy which was known as the Donatist controversy. So a question was asked, they've denied Jesus, for crying out loud, they must be done, cut off for good. And the response comes back in large part from Augustine, I think, but others as well. The model's Peter. So the scriptural model is Peter. Peter under pressure, and it's not even torture, it's a question from a maid around a fire, right? Yeah, big time, right? Remember, the weakest link in the papacy is the first link. So Peter renounces, Peter actually, I forget which version of the gospel it is, but Peter in the original, it's more like Peter, he calls a curse upon himself. So it's something like this. Peter says, may God damn me to hell if I know who that man is. That's a curse. And Peter is welcomed back by Jesus. And because of that, because of the master's own example in dealing with his friend, the church knew, of course you can come back if you're genuinely contrite. So they did renounce. They were taken back so long as they were genuinely sorry. Yeah, it's a great question. Pray tonight for those brothers and sisters who are imprisoned and tortured because they love Jesus. Let's see if, just so we can get, I want to make sure we can kind of get to other, do you guys got anything here? No pressure, you're like the only table that hasn't come up with anything, but.
I do have a little question just for historical context. I watched the movie Paul the Apostle this weekend, and so his little tribe, if you want to call it, run by Aquila and Priscilla, and Paul was kind of the head of that, I guess, until he was imprisoned. But I wonder where Peter fit into that time. Did Peter and Paul know each other? Did they live in Rome at the same time? Were there different factions of Christianity within the same city? How do they interact?
So Paul himself acknowledges that he's not the founder of the church in Rome. So Peter and Paul certainly know each other. They've encountered each other a number of times. There's the famous example of Paul in the letter to the Galatians rebuking Peter. They acknowledge each other as brothers. They're both apostles, meaning they're witnesses of the resurrection, sent by the Master himself to testify to what it is that God has done in Jesus. Paul's often known as the apostle to the Gentiles, and Peter is the apostle to the Jews. Peter's actually the apostle to both. He goes to both first. So there's no reason to think that they aren't close, other than the fact that brothers who love each other. This is what we're looking for in the church right now. Rebuke each other when they do wrong. That doesn't mean I don't like you. That means I love you. And so Paul, out of love, says this. So they overlap. We don't know for sure when Paul dies. It seems like Paul dies in 67. Peter dies in 64, for sure. Paul seems to die a few years later. Paul's a Roman citizen, that's why he gets to be beheaded. Peter's a not Roman citizen, that's why he's crucified. What else did you ask? Yeah. So remember, the Christian community is small. Very small. The church in Corinth is 100 people. It's this. This is the church in Corinth. The church in Rome is 5 times this. Right? It's a small, tight community, which makes the explosive nature of the growth even more remarkable. And it's just that it's an explosion out to the world. Yeah, just hang up for the mic.
This is almost like a technical question, and that is, where were the apostles when Christ was being crucified? It didn't seem like they were afraid to go there. And who was there? I mean, in the Bible, when I read it, it says there were women,
And John.
Mary, and
Right. So at the foot of the cross is just John,
Okay.
in terms of the apostles.
All right. So
Everybody
John-
else, all the other apostles run from the Garden of Gethsemane on. So when they come to arrest Jesus, they all flee,
They flee.
which Jesus had said was going to happen.
Okay.
Why do they flee? Because I don't want you to do that to me.
Courage. And John was there, though.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, the other question is, when he said, behold my son, who was he talking to? And
No, he says, behold your son. So Jesus
Behold
on
your
the
son.
cross
Right.
in the Gospel of John says a number of things, but two things, the one that you're alluding to. So he looks at John and says, son, behold your mother,
Okay.
which is not just words to John. The church has always understood that that's words to us, that the Lord is giving us in a particular way to his mother.
Okay.
And then he says, woman, behold your son. And so, and then from that moment on, the Gospel of John says, John takes her under his heart, literally, or into his home. And so John cares for Mary until she's no longer with us. There's a house in Ephesus, which is where John would have lived and where he's buried. So that is both the Lord giving John to Mary and Mary's care to John, but it's also the Lord giving us to Our Lady in a particular way, his mother.
Okay.
That's why we refer to Mary not only as the mother of the Lord, but the mother of us all. Yeah.
One other question that's really different from that. This will be my last one. A couple of weeks ago, I was telling you that I intellectually understand being a Christian really well, and the proofs and all of the physical evidence. To take that last great step, and I don't think it's going to happen with an epiphany with me like it does with some. It's a slow thing. And you said, pray for grace, which I've been doing. It does seem to have some effect. But why did you say that? Why did you say pray for grace?
Yeah, so no one becomes a Christian by arriving at intellectual answers any more than you get married because, the person crosses off all the items on the list. Like, you don't marry somebody because you go, I have no more objections to marrying you. At least you shouldn't. All right, that's not a good way to enter into a relationship. You marry somebody because you, as a person, have shown me by our experience in relationship that it is worth taking the risk to surrender myself to you. I think you will, and I think you will because I've known you now for some time. I think you will care for me. And I know I find life by caring for you, by sacrificing for you, by loving you, by pouring myself out for you. Like, I find life by doing that. That's why you get married, at least ideally, okay? That's the best analogy I know of to becoming a disciple. My intellect can only get me so far. There are no, at least in my mind, there are no reasonable objections to being a Christian. But there's two conversions that happens. There's a conversion of the intellect and there's a conversion of the will. Oftentimes there's decades between those two. So your intellect gets to a point where you go, I think this is true. Like, I think the evidence really shows me that Jesus is Lord, not a liar or a lunatic, and not a legend. And I think the evidence shows me, historically, that there are more reasons to believe that the resurrection happened than that it did not. It's the only historically plausible explanation for the growth of Christianity, that the tomb was empty and that Jesus was seen bodily risen from the dead by more than one person on many occasions, including people who did not believe in him, who hated him, most especially Paul. That's great. That's the intellect. That doesn't make me a Christian. So there are a lot of people with that. The hang-up is faith means to be able to say to God, I'm yours. Do whatever you want. And that terrifies us. Because we're wired, this is one of the results of the fall, we're wired to not trust God. That's one of the birth defects, if you will, spiritually speaking, that we got from Adam and Eve. I'm inclined to not trust God and to be selfish. I want to be me. I want to be God. I want to be on the throne of my life. And you're asking me to get off the throne and give it to you, and I don't know what you're going to ask of me. And this is where we start thinking stupid things like, you're probably going to ask me to do something I hate, which just doesn't sound like a God who'd become man and go to the cross and die for you. Like, really? Like, where'd that come from? Probably hell, right? But the act of surrender requires the conversion of my will. And the easiest way to, at least in my experience, to overcome that is to ask God to give me grace, which is to say his supernatural strength, to be able to make a decision which on my own I don't want to make and can't make. And back to what we said at the very beginning of this little section, the easiest ways I know for us practically to do that right now are to pray daily, read the Gospels, and get to Mass. And then hang out with other Christians. And I mean, the purpose of the tables for us right now is to be able to know, okay, there's people who are willing to invest time in talking to me. That's why these folks are at the tables with you. Like, that's what they want to do, you know? Like, the food's good, but they ain't here for the food. They're here for you. Like, they love you, even though they've just begun to meet you. And so they would be more than open, like, grab coffee, grab lunch, go to breakfast after Mass on a Sunday, whatever, and just let them kind of pour into you as you ask questions and ask them their story. Like, how did you get to the point where you were able to surrender? That way you're hearing a multiplicity of voices as opposed to just, wah, who quotes other people. Okay? I'll keep going? You tell me. Anybody else? No Catholics can ask questions. No, you can't make a comment. You are moot. Il muto. I'm feeling lenient. Go ahead. Yeah, ask that while I pick a good one. Go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on grace. A lot of people in our world are fixated on what they can see, what they can touch, what their senses tell them. And grace is none of those. As Father said, it's supernatural. God is spirit. He's not something we can Jesus, of course, we could touch, but God the Father is pure spirit. And I teach catechism, and I tell my fourth graders and now my sixth graders that grace is your superpower. Superman's got his, Spider-Man's got his. Grace is a gift from God that we don't merit, but he gives it to us, and it enables us to do what we couldn't do on our own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's spot on. That's how I think of grace too. Grace is power. Let me. There's some. These are all excellent questions that folks have either emailed in or put down maybe on cards. Let me just hit a couple of these because they're really worth it, and we'll go. So one question is, what happens to those who are never exposed to Christianity? Do they go to hell? Do you believe non-Catholics will go to heaven? Do non-believers have a chance after death to repent and go to heaven? Let's try to answer that real quick. So the church is teaching, so here's the beauty of the catechism, right? So who's got their catechism with them? Can I see yours real quick? So just so I can give you the paragraph number. So paragraph. Starting in 836, and especially 839. Has to do with who belongs to the Catholic Church, and then the church and non-Christians. And then paragraph 846 and following is a little section entitled, Outside the Church There Is No Salvation. So, let me say what it reads here. So how are we to understand this, that quote-unquote, outside the church there is no salvation? Reformulated positively, it means that all salvation comes from Christ the head through the church, which is his body. Basing itself on scripture and tradition, the council, that is to say, a significant time that took place in the 1960s, teaches that the church, a pilgrim now on earth, is necessary for salvation. The one Christ is the mediator and the way of salvation. He is present to us in his body, which is the church. He himself explicitly asserted the necessity of faith and baptism, and thereby affirmed at the same time the necessity of the church, which men enter through baptism as through a door. Hence, here's the key, they could not be saved who, knowing that the Catholic Church was founded as necessary by God through Christ, would refuse either to enter it or to remain in it. This affirmation is not aimed at those who, through no fault of their own, do not know Christ and his church. Those who, through no fault of their own, do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, but who nevertheless seek God with a sincere heart and, moved by grace, try in their actions to do his will as they know it through the dictates of their conscience, these two may achieve eternal salvation. Although in ways known to God, to himself, God can lead those who, through no fault of their own, are ignorant of the gospel to that faith without which it is impossible to please him, the church still has the obligation and also the sacred right to evangelize all men. So, a couple things of note there. By all means, the church does not teach that if you are not Catholic, you're going to hell. There might be Catholics who say that, but that's not what the church says. Somebody asked a question with regards to the scandals going on in the church right now. This is a great example. So, why are there not more Catholics? Because of Catholics. That's why. Right? So clearly, there are in a large number of people right now who are justifiably outraged, frustrated, angry, disappointed, confused by the behavior of those who are supposed to be shepherds of the church. Their behavior is so scandalous. Remember what scandal means? Scandal means it causes somebody to trip. It's so scandalous that it potentially keeps people from entering into the church, or it leads people out of the church. It should be no giant leap to understand that when I see somebody who's supposed to be telling me all this is true, and they're living intentionally a completely different kind of life, well, that causes me to question, well, I don't know if this is true then, right? Like, I get that. That's not to say that that I can use somebody else's sin as an example, because everybody here sins. Like, the only thing I can promise you about me is I will disappoint you. Like, I am not flawless, and neither are you. And this church is not flawless. It's made up of people like you and me, all right? And we hurt each other. But it's one thing to sin. It's another thing to live a double life. That's what we call hypocrisy. I'm pretending to be one thing, but I really have no intention of being that thing. Right? Does that make sense? That's a completely different matter than I'm trying to be holy and I still struggle. So two people can actually do the exact same behavior. One of them is quick to repent, fall to their knees, ask God to forgive. The other person doesn't even give a thought to repenting. I could care less. Same behavior, different response, two very different situations. Okay, does that make sense? All right? So it's possible, this is why scandal is so devastating. It's possible right now, or somebody who, growing up as a child in the faith, experiences as a child in those formative years the scandalous witness of somebody who's either a priest or a bishop or who works for the church, and they behave a particular way, and it's so whatever, they just go, I don't ever want anything to do with those people. I get that. It's going to take a lot of healing in a person like that, and the healing is going to come both from grace that God's going to give and from encountering people who are authentic for them to come back. We got a lot of people like that too. So it's one thing to there's those who know the truth and reject it. Like, I will not enter into it, and I know that's true. The church is simply trying to say, like, we don't know how somebody like that could be saved. You have rejected truth. But it's a different matter for somebody who is really struggling because of the witness that I've seen. So we want to pray for those people too, and that might be some of us in here. Does that help? Does that make some sense? Do non-believers have a chance after death to repent and go to heaven? No. You die and you die. Okay? So after death comes judgment. But God judges us based on what we know. Like, when you die, it's not like you get a quiz on trigonometry and you were an English major and, man, too bad, like, bummer for you. This isn't a pop quiz, right? So I can't be accountable for what I don't know. Like, God doesn't send somebody who lives in Madagascar who's never heard of the gospel to hell because they never believed in Jesus, because the guy would be sitting there going, I never had a chance. I never heard of Jesus, right? But what does that person have? He has a conscience. He's able to discern right from wrong by reason. I should do the good and avoid evil. I can pursue God as I understand him. So there's all sorts of things which I can do, which unknowingly I'm actually living, at least in part, a Christian life. Does that make sense to people? One last thing real quick. Can you be Catholic? This same person. Can you be Catholic and not agree with all the church's beliefs? That's a really common question. So as we shift into this next point of discernment for us, just hear this. This is why to become Catholic takes so long, because it is both the conversion of my intellect and my will. So for somebody to become Catholic at the Easter Vigil, which is when it typically happens, unless you're dying, then just call me, and I'll send Father Dave. You get it. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. He has more time. Kidding. Call me, okay? Actually, call Kathy. She'll call me. So we're going to give you a card, okay, so that you don't forget this. But you have to be able to say these words out loud. And you have to mean it. Otherwise, it would be a lie, and that would mean it's just really stupid. Stay home. The words are, I believe and accept as true all that the Holy Catholic Church teaches and professes to be revealed by God. You can't say that. Neither I nor anybody else is going to go, then you're going to die in hell. It's just, then you shouldn't become Catholic. Because that's what it means to be Catholic. So at a certain point, like, you shouldn't expect by the time you get done with becoming Catholic that you've memorized the catechism. What you should expect, that you are at the place where you're able to go, I am at a place now where I am able to say, I trust. I don't understand that yet. I don't have an objection to it, though. And I trust that if I would engage my intellect, I would understand that. Or if I would do the work, I would understand it. But I just trust. It's like a dating proposal. It's like, if you just keep saying to the person you're thinking of marrying, like you got 5,000 questions, and you go, well, what about this? At a certain point, you just go, you know what? I don't need any more questions answered. I know you. And I trust you. And I love you. And so I give myself to you. And it's something very much like that with the church. You get to a place where you're able to just go, I got no more objections. I don't think I'm being lied to here. And if you do, then just, keep having the food and just don't go to the vigil, I guess. But we love having you, regardless. So you have to be able to say that. Does that help with that question? You had a question, Evan?
So as you were mentioning that those who are not Catholic don't have the opportunity to repent once you get that, I thought that, and I don't know, heard this or read this, that after death, Jesus approaches or meets everyone and gives them that choice. Will you follow me or?
No, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Yeah, that would be like get out of jail free card. See what that does? See, here's the problem. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on, especially when we get into the moral life. freedom is a remarkable burden. Because in essence, what we're saying, the reason why we want that is I don't want to have to be accountable for the choices that I've made here. Like, how dare you hold me accountable for the things that I've chosen to do? Like, who do you think you are? Which is a really adolescent mindset. So freedom is a burden, I often think of. Like, ignorance is not bliss, ignorance is just ignorance. But once you know truth, then you're obliged to follow it, because the alternative means you don't live with integrity.
So for those who don't know truth, then they're held to the standard that they know of.
Yep, those who don't know the truth of Jesus. Yeah, God's not going to judge somebody who doesn't know Jesus based on the Lord. He's going to go by conscience. Did you follow the dictates of your conscience? Avoid evil, do good. Treat your neighbor the way you want to be treated. Which, by the way, is not at all a common way of living in various other religions. Right? The golden rule is not universal at all. So, yeah, the Lord... Somebody asks this question of Jesus, actually, and maybe that's the best way to end, and then we can close. So somebody comes to Jesus and says, Lord, will there be many people who go to heaven? It's a safe question, right? And the Lord answers, you, Evan, strive to enter through the narrow gate. Forget about them. I'll take care of them. You don't have to answer for them. You have to answer for you. Right? And so it's not to say that the question isn't worth knowing, because we want to try to be able to answer questions for people when they ask things like, hey, what's the church think about non-Christians or non-Catholics? But at the end of the day, I can also use it as a dodge question. And the Lord calls my bluff when he knows I'm using it as a dodge question. And he says, just forget about the people in Outer Mongolia. I'll take care of them. What do you know? And what are you doing in response to what you know? And that's, for most of us, enough to keep us occupied. At least for me, right? Okay, I'm done with Outer Mongolia. Good, cool. Okay. I'll just go to the barbecue instead.